You can see what I've done today by giving you that last sentence on the readings that we have this week from Hunter to discuss basically the chapter and how you understand the difference between the Christian right and the Anabaptist tradition, which both would come under the sort of rubric of conservatives, and what you have to decide at this point with the paper and just reading the chapter is to look and to see where the Anabaptist tradition fits in respect to what Hunter has written about the Christian right. First, some basic things. Neo-Anabaptist, obviously neo means new. Ana is a basic prefix that means sort of again. So an Anabaptist is someone who is committed to rebaptism, and this was particularly so obviously out of the Reformation in the 16th century, when the Anabaptists, if I can talk about them as a tradition, are growing a movement, particular in Germany, or what's now known as Germany, was something that was a great threat to people of the Reformation, like people like Luther and Calvin, because what the notion of rebaptism signified was the complete sort of symbolic abandonment of the previous tradition, which had welded state power with the church. In the Roman Catholic tradition, we know that's the case, where the power of the church was aligned with the power of the state, and there was then the what you might call the struggle between who was the sort of top dog and so forth. And Luther didn't abandon this himself, because he needed the recourse of the political state, i.e. the German princes in Saxony, to actually support him, to prevent him being taken by the Roman Catholic authorities and presumably imprisoned and worse, executed. So he aligned himself with them, or they aligned themselves with him from the standpoint of their own particular interests. And so from that standpoint then developed a tradition, I'm speaking in very simple terms here, between what Luther called the left hand, the left hand of God, or the sword of God, which is the state, so that God sanctions the state, and the state works in conjunction with the church, and actually buttresses it and gives its territorial being within a Reformed tradition, whereas the Anabaptist tradition was a much more severe tradition, because the notion of rebaptizing oneself, and don't forget that in that particular period, baptism is, if you're a Protestant now and you believe in believer's baptism, baptism then was something that was primarily done shortly after birth, or what you might call christening, from that believer's baptism position. But what it meant was, up to that period, for at least 1,000 years, up to the 16th century, it meant basically incorporation within society. So that when someone was, quote, baptized as a baby, it meant that they became then a good citizen. This is after the, what I'd call the Constantinian tradition that Hunter mentions from the Edict of Milan in AD 313, whereby Christianity came under the rubric of the Roman Empire and was promoted by the emperor, to the effect that if you are to be a good Christian, then you are to be a good member of the state, and vice versa. So in the 16th century, there were other movements similar to it, but I'm just focusing in a general way at the time of the Reformation, when groups of Christians were talking about being rebaptized, it wasn't simply the element of what you might call, if you're in the Baptist tradition or a Pentecostal tradition today, where you're being baptized as an adult, believer's baptism. What it signified was that you are sort of stepping out of everything and making a statement against the state, and that you now had a refined new existence. And that was a very great threat to the Roman Catholic Church and to people like Luther and Calvin, because what it signified in a great way was, as Hunter brings out, it signified distrust of the state. So you have a real separation here between the state, the political, functioning, economic, social authority, and the life of the believer, not just in one's personal piety, in other words, in your prayer closet at home, but in your attitude towards society as a social community. In other words, then, the church, is in its, quote, rebaptism, has now become a political entity that vies with the state in itself. Now that may be something that is a bit too stark in the way that I've portrayed it there, but I want you to get the difference between what you might call conservative Christianity, or the Christian right, has been interpreted by Hunter in respect to the 1970s and 80s with the moral majority and so forth, the focus on the family, and the current movement of what I'll call Christian nationalism, that is still promoting the idea that the former President Trump had the election illegitimately taken away from him, and that he represents what would be called a Christian conservative position. This is quite different from an Anabaptist tradition, because of the element that the Christian nationalism, in a sense, depends on the power of the state to support itself. I may have said this, I was once going in a parking lot in a fairly conservative, wealthy church in Chico, and I saw, I think it was a Mercedes-Benz car, fairly new, and on the back of it was a fish sign, and the fish is an old symbol that was a clue, an identification mark for early Christians in respect to the way that they would recognize one another in the midst of being persecuted by the Roman authorities, because the Greek word for fish, ichthus, each letter signified a particular theology of Christ. Ichthus, I-C-H, T-H-U-S, Jesus, Christos, Theos, Huios, Soter. Jesus, Huios, Son, Soter, Saviour, Theos, God, Christos, Christ. So there you have that absolutely dense theological articulation that's found within the symbol of simply a fish. Just draw a fish with its fin at the back, and then the body of the fish, and you put that on a wall, and people will know that you are a Christian. And of course that's true today. In other words, we've all seen all sorts of fishes, haven't we, on the backs of cars. Sometimes you've got fish that are turned upside down, where inside of the fish there looks like something that's like a reptile, and the fish has got legs. In other words, the fish really came out of the water, which is basically an inverted notion of Christianity, in that Christianity isn't true and evolution is true. So there is the, I don't know what to call it, the agnostic or the unbeliever, the atheist, making a statement for him or herself in respect to what the fish means. Using the same kind of, it's not over, it's not covert here, it's very overt and very obvious. But the point it was making is, which I've gone off track slightly, is that when I was in this parking lot and I was seeing this fish, this was an unusual fish because it was quite large and this beautiful car, but inside the fish was the American flag. the red, white and blue, the stripes and so forth. So the question that rose in my mind then is what sort of fish is this? Is it an American fish? In other words, it's primarily to be interpreted through the lens of the political identity, the national identity of the United States, or is it the other way around? Is it a Christian fish? In other words, that we are Christians who are Americans, as opposed to being Americans who are Christians. You can argue either way on that, depending upon your sensibilities and which you think is the most significant and most important. What Hunter wants to argue, of course, is that the Christian right sees their commitment to Christ through the lens of the American Republic. And therefore, to be a good American is to be a good Christian, a good citizen from that standpoint. And in many ways, that fits with the perspective throughout the Middle Ages in Europe with the Roman Catholic Church, in a different setting, if I can draw that analogy. But in this particular case, in other words, with the Neo-Anabaptist tradition, if there's a fish there, it's certainly not coloured by the American flag. It's because of the distrust of the state. And what this deals with is basically the element of what's the connection, and this obviously relates to social justice, is what is the connection between Christianity and power? Because the Anabaptist tradition rejects the notion of power being allied with a Christian position and sees it antagonistic, in a sense, to the way of Christ. The way of Christ, I'll put it in terms of one of the forefront theologians of the last generation, now deceased, John Yoder, Y-O-D-E-R. If you really want to follow this up, you must read his book, The Politics of Jesus, which is in your bibliography. Is that he makes a statement that one of the earliest confessions of what it means to be a Christian, this is from Romans chapter 10, I'll give it to you in Greek, it's Jesus Kurios. Jesus obviously means Jesus. Kurios is the Greek word for Lord. And you don't, in Greek, you don't necessarily have to have the verb to be. So in other words, instead of saying Jesus is Lord, you can say Jesus Lord, and it means Jesus is Lord. You don't have to have the verb to be expressed there. So the elemental foundation in respect to what it was that a Christian was baptized into or from, it was from the confession that Jesus is Lord. In other words, Caesar is not Lord. Caesar is subsumed under Jesus, under Jesus. So that was this is what Yoda is arguing, that was a political statement. That when a Christian, even someone who couldn't read or write, when a Christian was saying in that Greek context, that Greek word, saying Jesus Kurios, he was saying Jesus is Lord. Jesus is Lord over Saviour, Lord over Caesar, and Lord over any other worldly power. So Yoda is saying this was not a statement of what he called, I think, or what Hunter describes him as saying, that this is a statement not of inner piety. In other words, it's not something that's simply left to the element of your prayer room where you acknowledge that Jesus is Lord, but basically as you function out in society, you function as Caesar being dominus, being Lord and ruler. Instead, you're making a statement that's a political statement that functions in the real world. So that according to Yoda then, the nature of the cosmos is run on the basis of Jesus Kurios, Jesus being Lord. And a characteristic of that is a rejection of violence. in respect to what that statement means as it's carried out in the social sphere of the church. Because the statement, Jesus is Lord, is not a statement that the state can make. It's a statement that the church makes because it's the foundation of its existence. The message that was preached by the early Christians was that Jesus is Lord, and then people who accepted that bondage and came under then the jurisdiction of Jesus as Lord, they then made up the church, the constitution of the church. The basic word ecclesia in Greek means called out. They were called out from the world into the lordship of Jesus, and that meant then that they were a political entity within themselves, and the characteristic of their forms of interaction and relationship with each other, and hence by that the world, was a rejection of violence. And there's a number of scriptures that you could look at in the New Testament, in the Gospels, that could further that. Hunter brings out one which I'll mention, that is the temptation of Jesus when he was tempted by the devil as he began his ministry, and the devil basically said to him, look, if you bow down and worship me, I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world. And of course Jesus refused that, which is then interpreted as that the way of Jesus is not the way of domination, of power, of the power of violence and so forth. Rather, it's the other way around. Jesus says, I did not come to sort of rule, but to serve. And any one of you who wants to be my follower, as you call me Lord, must be a servant of all. And in fact, he inverted the notions of what you might call the hierarchy of who are the, quote, preferred people. The preferred people, the people at the top of the greasy pole of life, are not those who have the best education, not those who have the most political clout through their breeding or social standing and economic status and so on, but their servitude to humanity. In other words, the greatest notion of following Jesus is to follow in his footsteps, which is to follow as a servant, as he was. I came not to be served, but to serve myself, says Jesus, and so on. So that's obviously, you can see that that's inimical. That's against the notion of power in terms of the rulers of the world, because all the rulers of the world, when you think about it, think it through in terms of societies that we know, everything is based upon what I'd call the bite of the bullet. Coherence, stability, the establishment of nations, the promulgation of ideas that keep people together and keep them in place, is all done from the power of violence or the power of gun. It's not just Chairman Mao and people like Stalin and Hitler who've recognized that. All societies have functioned on that basis. And the Anabaptists want to say, we are completely different. We will not function like that. We will not function in that way. Now, I'll try and give you an example of it in the way that may work. It's just a form of looking at an institution, because ultimately the Anabaptists would say all these institutions, these major political and economic institutions, the industrial military complex that Eisenhower warned about, all of them are based upon this ethos, this internal mechanism and identity of the power of the gun. And let me give you an example. This is my example. You take the organization, the institution Nike. Well, we all know about Nike. We know what it does. We know we may have even have. In fact, I've got a shirt, I think, that's got the what I call the tick. You know, the Nike tick on it. Well, Nike. The name comes from a Greek word, nikein or nikeo, and it means to conquer. So that the goddess Nike, in the Greek goddess is the basis that Nike has established itself as an institution. And of course it means then that Nike, the goddess, and now carried through into this global organization, Nike, is one who conquers. And if you look at their mission statements through the years, basically on a popular level, let's do it. In other words, let's act and let's do it. Let's do what? Well, one of the mission statements of Nike that I looked at several years ago is to be the best of the best. And that's why if you go into Nike's organizations, wherever you are, presumably what you'll see is pictures of Michael Jackson, Michael Jordan, Michael Jordan on the walls, and whoever is the best of the best of the best in respect to sports, of people who wear Nike's shoes and shirts and shorts and so forth. And so then you can imagine then that what Nike is an organization that's built around being the best of the best. And the job of the CEO and everybody else who's in Nike is to make sure that ethos, that mission statement, that characteristic becomes integral to the organization itself. So that I presume that means that somehow every employee of Nike somehow is oriented towards being the best of the best, whether it's a salesperson or whether it's an accountant or whatever. You're part of that organization. You're surrounded by it with the pictures of Michael Jordan and all the paraphernalia, the mission statements, everything that comes out of Nike promotes that. You can't be second, you can't be third. You've got to be first. You've got to be the best. If you're a presumably a weak person who's not very good at selling or very good at sport perhaps, or not very confident in yourself, it probably will mean that you won't last very long in the Nike organization. You might be on the bottom rung of the ladder, but you're not going to get up into the top echelons of the organization because you haven't got the ethos, you haven't got the spirit of the place. And I won't go into it any further, except I'll just bring out one example about whatever it was, 20 years ago, when it was brought out that Nike was doing what? Well, it was making its trainers in, I forget where it was, Southeast Asia, in which it was paying people something like 10 cents an hour to build these things, and then they were brought into the developed world, and Nike was selling these trainers for, at the time, $120 and so on. In other words, that's part of the ethos that's carried out through the whole system. Now, I'm just using that an example to say, now carry that through to the state, how the state functions. How the state functions in terms of a military-industrial complex. How, for example, the way that 5,000 US bases throughout the world, military bases, and there are 5,000 US military bases, is a way of propagandizing democracy and promoting democracy, which ultimately rests on the power of the gun. You see that with where George Bush Jr. went into Iraq on a preemptive strike in 2003 and so forth. So I'm saying all that to say that that's the nature of power, if I can put it that way. Whereas the Anabaptist tradition is one that moves completely away from that and doesn't want to function like that. The shocking state that a popular author advocates, that Hunter mentions, I'll mention it's on page 165 of Shane Claiborne. This is a good statement of a current theologian in the Anabaptist tradition, a social justice activist, if I can use that word, defined on the meaning inherent within the Anabaptist tradition. This is what he says: with governments that kill, we will not comply. With the theology of empire, we will not comply. With the business of militarism, we will not comply. With the hoarding of riches, we will not comply. With the dissemination of fear we will not comply. But today we pledge our allegiance to the kingdom of God. We pledge allegiance to the peace that is not like Rome's. We pledge allegiance to the gospel of enemy love. We pledge allegiance to the poor and the broken. We pledge allegiance. So then what you can see then is if I can use the Nike analogy, it's a different it's an upturning of the current status quo that functions in some sort of, in that sense, an economic sense, but in a political sense, and begins with a political identity that's based upon Jesus Kurios, and then is characterized by its ethics, primarily, let's say, from the Sermon on the Mount, love your enemies and so forth. And what this means then is that the task that the church has, and it's well put by Hunter, the task is to be the church, so that the church then is like a Nike organization but has a completely different identity. For example, the church has its own national holidays, it has its own institutions, it has its own culture, its own language. For example, just like the United States, the backed up by military power, has those holidays that establish who it is. The 4th of July and so forth, the independence against the British that was hard fought so many years ago, the festival of Thanksgiving in respect to the beginnings, you might say, of the nation and what that nation would be as it expanded westward and through the power of violence took over as it launched itself westward in its manifest destiny and subjugated all the Native American Indians and pushed the Mexicans out and the British and the French and in places the Spanish, and established itself in terms of who it is. Well, in the same way, the church has got its own festivals, Easter, Christmas, its own identity structures of coming of age, baptism, its own coalition of relationships based around the Eucharist, or the Lord's Supper as it's called in the New Testament. Now, in today's world, the church has been pushed aside in many respects by secular culture and seen as something that is really, it's there, but it's sort of in the suburbs, but it's not really that it's not that clued up. It's not that powerful when it comes to the imposition of itself and its values. I'm thinking of it from an Anabaptist tradition now. When it comes to then its values in respect to this dominant status quo. The only way that it can be marshaled into being used in power has been, well, from one example would be the Christian right that wants to buttress the state with its own power on the basis of interpreting passages like Romans chapter 13, of saying that God sanctions the power of the gun and we Christians go along with it, so the church then can buttress the state and can use violence. Of course, the Anabaptist tradition pulls away from that. And now, just in conclusion then, is that Hunter, his opinion of it, is that the Anabaptist tradition is essentially a world-hating theology. Now that's up for grabs. In other words, to what extent then is the rejection of the world something that the church should be doing, and to what extent does that rejection of the world follow from the commandments of Jesus, and does it include that kind of examples of ideology that Shane Claiborne, that I just mentioned a while ago, or is it that if that is the case, the Anabaptist tradition is such, what practical use is it? This is one of the arguments against it. What practical use is it in the nature of the world? Because what's going to happen? For example, what happened in 2001 on September the 11th? What did the Anabaptist tradition have to say in respect to the way that the Twin Towers were put down? Did they have anything to say that's positive? Whereas the, what you might call, they weren't called Christian nationalists then, but the Christians who got behind George Bush basically said, we are seeking justice and we will go wherever we can in the world and we'll bring these people who've done this, and any nation that's behind them, we will bring them to account. In other words, we will use the power of violence. Is that the response? So you can see, I've done all that to say, I want you to get an idea of the Anabaptist tradition, because we're now reaching a point where we're going to have to, or you're going to have to, decide in some way which of these three traditions, if any of the three of them, or the alternative that Hunter is going to give us, the Christian right, the Christian left, the Anabaptist tradition, and then what Hunter is now going to describe in the next couple of weeks, to finish off reading his book, which is the practice of faithful presence. How then does the church engage the world from a social justice standpoint?